All right. So, as I mentioned to Aaron before class, today is really just Jeremiah reduced down to 1 week. So we are kind of jumping the gun as far as, um, I guess, our Sunday morning things go, just because we're still 4 weeks out from finishing Jeremiah. Maybe it's I don't. I'm not the one putting together the material this time around, so I'm just getting ready for next time. So we're in the final days of Judah, and as we have been doing, I'll try and include a map. I couldn't find one with less notes on here. I could find a map with more notes on it. And I figured that one would be super unhelpful because you can't read the notes that are on this one. As I guess I can kind of explain what's going on. This is the map of Israel, or not Israel, Judah, at the time of Josiah. And by this point, Pharaoh Necho has come up from Egypt. He has conquered Philistia, Samaria, and Phoenicia. The Assyrians have moved down there in alliance up to this point. And you have different, I guess, tribes would be a way of kind of phrasing it. They're paying taxes to different kings. Josiah is not doesn't have great control over the southern parts of Judah or even the areas of Bethel. He really only has a stronghold in the small area around Jerusalem. And so that's Geba, Bethlehem, and Jerusalem, that kind of little strip right there. And it very quickly changes. As we kind of talked about last week, so we talked about Hezekiah quite a bit last week, and then we kind of breezed through his son and grandson because those kings are space holders. They're I don't know how better else to put it other than they're just mentioned so that we know who comes next, and who comes next is Josiah. And so Josiah becomes king when he's 8. It is very young. And I don't know, this picture makes him kind of look like a girl. And so I don't know if it's the curly hair or what, but yeah, it's the curly hair and the dress that makes him look like a girl. But it's Josiah becomes king at 8 years old. And it's one of those, no one's really expecting him to last long. His father, Ammon, bad king, so they're assuming what's all of Ammon's advisors, we're just going to keep doing bad. And that's what's going to happen. However, as we've been talking in our Sunday morning classes, luckily there's a prophet named Jeremiah who's called up to preach to Josiah, preach to all of Judah, and he'll be doing that for 40 years. I feel like we say this every week in Bible class, but he's not successful for 40 years. And so I was talking to someone I guess a couple weeks ago, I went back to Dallas for a wedding, and I went to my church I grew up in, and one of the preachers said, "So what are you guys studying in Green Lawn?" And I was like, "Well, we're doing a study of Jeremiah." It's like, "So how well is your impression of Jeremiah?" It's like, which part? The part where I'm preaching or the part where I'm bashing my head into the wall for 40 years? Because I know that's kind of a more modern way of thinking of frustration, but it is still one of those. He has to be like super frustrated after year 1. Yeah. And he does that for 40 more years. Another prophet that we see kind of at this beginning point in Josiah is Zephaniah. Sorry, I was looking at my notes and it's not in the notes. Zephaniah, he is a prophet, and he speaks about the revival and the renewal of Judah on a more what's the word? On a population level instead of on the level of the king. Because we see kind of it's recorded of, well, Josiah finds the law, and when he does, he tears his cloak, and they institute reforms in the temple and all that. Well, Zephaniah is looking at what that looks like for the common man, the people who don't go to the temple, who are in the streets. Zephaniah preaches this message of renewal for Judah, but he is very short-lived. He only is in the time of Josiah, which I guess isn't that short-lived because it is during the whole reign of a king. It's short compared to Jeremiah, who's around forever, it seems, during this time. I don't know why I included two pictures of this, but I guess. So, as I mentioned, Jeremiah finds the law. He institutes reforms in the temple. He institutes reforms for the people. Some say it was early on when he was 8 still. Some say it was closer to 18 or 21, depending on how we want to place it in line of where Jeremiah comes in and where Zephaniah comes in. He's not super mature when they find the law, and yet he does something very mature in reinstituting the law, very wise as a king, even though he's still in his youth. And then Josiah kind of does something stupid. So I mentioned him earlier, Pharaoh Necho, which there's so many asides. We'll go on some of the sides. So Pharaoh Necho and Jeremiah is considered a servant of the Lord, which is kind of weird, just because. And then we'll come back to this. Actually, we'll go to there now. We'll fast forward a couple years. What we get is when the prophet Habakkuk comes up, and this is he's prophesying during the time of Josiah's son and grandson. One thing that Habakkuk is really hitting home is this question on how can pagans serve the Lord's purpose? How can nations that aren't Judah, who aren't people of God, who they're not related to Abraham even a little bit, because you have Moab and Edom and Ammon who are kind of related to the lineage of Abraham, and you even get some who claim, well, the Arabians, even further to the southeast, they're even connected to Abraham from Ishmael. And so that's a huge question, because it's not those people. It's the people from Egypt, from Assyria, from Babylon. They're the ones who are being described as servants of the Lord, because Habakkuk is also writing at the same time as Jeremiah. Everyone's writing at the same time as Jeremiah, or maybe not Jeremiah writing, because Jeremiah doesn't write it down. It's Baruch, and Baruch does that for a couple of years, a couple of times. Anyway, but Habakkuk, his sermons are focused on what does it mean when someone else outside of Judah is a servant of the Lord. And going back to Necho, he's one of those guys. He's the Pharaoh of Egypt. By this point, the dynasties have changed so much to where this isn't even, many argue, this isn't even a Pharaoh who's connected to the Pharaoh of the Exodus. There's just been so many rises and falls of families. A couple of weeks ago, we went through all the different kings of Israel, and it was, well, this family, and then for like a week, this guy was in charge, and that week, and then Ahab's family comes up, and they kind of put everything to rest. Well, Egypt, they do that every 2 or 3 generations. So a dynasty could be really long or really short. And what we saw, or not to go off on Egyptian history, but what we see is it's late teen dynasties. So it's like 17th or 18th dynasty during the time of Exodus. But Necho is part of the 30th dynasty. or somewhere in there. And so it's been several dynasties have switched over. They're killing princes and kings, and they're going up to war. So even if we want to go back to even something more closer, something closer to where we are in the Kings and Prophets, the king or the Pharaoh who comes and sacks the temple under Jehoshaphat, that's not even someone who's related to Necho. So again, that's a lot on Egyptian history. But during the reign of Josiah, Pharaoh Necho decides, I'm tired of being the ally of Assyria. I would like to be the enemy of Assyria. Or it's not necessarily thinking I want to be the enemy. It's I no longer need Assyria to give me my strength and my support. I don't have to be second fiddle to this guy anymore. I could be the one commanding other nations to support me. However, at this time, Josiah has kind of gained back some control around Megiddo, which we'll go back to this map because it's a little bit bigger. It's this area right here. So by this time, Josiah has retaken Samaria, most of what would be the northern kingdom that had fallen. There had kind of become a vacuum because Necho would come up and he pushed up here against the Philistines and against the nation of Aram and Phoenicia, half of the Assyrians. And the Assyrians kind of came down, but they left Phoenicia and they kind of came down here, but Necho pulled back into Philistia, and so there became a vacuum. And so Josiah was able to fill that vacuum. Anyway, but what happens is Necho says, well, now I have to go up to Assyria. I'm going to attack them in their capital, which is up here in Carchemish and Harah. And so what we see is, well, now he has to go through Judah. Judah's the one thing stopping him. More modern example, World War I and World War II, the Germans don't invade France by their border touching France, they invade through Belgium. It's kind of the same thing. They're cutting through a shortcut because Egypt could cut through this area that has no one in control and just go into Syria. But that's through the middle of the desert, and they're kind of expecting a surprise attack from this side. They're not expecting something to come from Judah because they know Judah's not going to ever challenge Assyria. Assyria is kind of getting very prideful in this moment. And so Pharaoh Necho says, all right, I'm going to march through the valley, along the sea, and then cross into the valley in Judah, and then I'll continue forward up into Tyre and Sidon, go attack Assyria. Because also, I don't know if you can tell, this is where Babylon's pushing it. So Assyria is already weaker. Babylon's a growing threat. And so Necho is taking advantage of, I'm going to get what's mine while I still can. And the prophets and all of the advisors of the king say, Josiah, especially Jeremiah, there's several parts in Jeremiah because Jeremiah is not in order. And so there's some, it's like in the mid, it's at the beginning, middle, and end, but it's all telling Josiah, don't go to war against the Pharaoh. Because if you do, you will die, because God has chosen Pharaoh as a servant of the Lord. He has been chosen. He has given success to the Pharaoh. So by you going up and fighting in Megiddo, you will just lose. Like, that's all. Like, you're not going to win this battle, no matter how favorable you think you are. And it's one of those moments where Josiah's like, no, you can't be serious. I'm the king of God's people. And that, I think that's maybe why Habakkuk's focus is so strongly on, hey, pagan countries can also be chosen by God to do God's work. Because this is an aftermath of Josiah was king of God's people. God's favor should only be with them, and which we can also look forward to that argument from the Sadducees and Pharisees of, well, no, it's the Jews. Why is Christ eating with the Gentiles and healing Gentiles? God's chosen people is the Jews. It's only to the Jews. We don't need to be focusing on anything else. And so that pattern repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. We can even push it forward even to today. Well, God can only work through the church. It's only by the church that God's will is done. Well, yes and no. God does do work through the church, but God also does work through all of his creation. And so that's a weird aside to say Josiah goes up to battle and dies. And so his reign is very short-lived, and or short-lived because he's not a very old adult when he gets there. It is long because he started when he was 8, but we will go ahead, move on. Interestingly, the second son of Josiah becomes king then, and that's Jehoahaz. There's not a whole lot on him, other than people decided that at one point this is what he looked like. This is what he should look like. I don't know if these are supposed to be coins or like stamps, or I don't know. But if you want to find these, Wikipedia has all of these as the images of kings. And so, except for like a few which actually have paintings because they were worthy of being painted, or I don't know. A lot of these kings, especially the ones that reigned for very short, artists like Rembrandt and Michelangelo and like Da Vinci, thought, yeah, no, they're not worth painting at all, because they're focused on the good characters, the fan favorites, the good kings, the prophets, especially we can even think to like children's Bibles class where it's like you're not talking about Jeconiah or Jehoahaz Bible class. You're talking about David, and you're talking about Solomon and Elijah and like Elisha, like, and even then you're like cutting a whole lot out. But that's another aside. I'm just full of asides tonight. Possibly it could be because I'm almost done with my PowerPoint, but that's fine. So Jehoahaz emerges as king. He's kind of like his father. He doesn't listen, but he's also like all of his ancestors who weren't good kings and decided, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I want, and I'm going to do evil before the Lord, and there's nothing that's going to go wrong. Well, as I mentioned, Prophet Habakkuk comes up, and he's preaching to I guess I misspoke earlier. It's not Josiah's grandson, it's Josiah's sons. Because the next 2 kings are, well, actually the next 3 are all sons of Josiah. And so we get a lot of, it's this message of God doesn't have to work through just a certain group of people. But Jehoahaz, at this point, let's go back to the map. By this point, Babylon is at the gate. There is no more Assyria. There's just Babylon. Egypt is still around. They've taken more coastline, and they've engaged in battles against the Babylonians. And so Jehoahaz says, you know what, well, I can just be evil, and I can command armies, and I can do whatever I want. That doesn't work out for him because he is then captured. And then his older brother, Jehoiakim, which I will probably looking at. There's 2 kings that happen tonight, Jehoiakim and Jehoiachin. Similar to Elijah and Elisha, I will be saying both when I mean the other. And so I'll probably, Jehoiakim, I'll try and pause. So Jehoiakim, the older brother of Jehoahaz, son of Josiah, becomes king. He is not a very good-looking king. He's just considered deformed, and he's angry, he's wrathful, he has some problems. But what happens is, as Babylon not Babylon. Babylon keeps pushing in from the north. Judah is trying to escape by just pushing everything south, which does not happen. Help that Egypt's there, and Egypt's still not wanting to go out without a fight. And so Pharaoh captures Jehoiakim and imprisons him in Egypt. It's one of those, yeah, he's still king, but the Egyptians would say he's not, because the Egyptians decide to install Jehoiachin. And Jehoiachin, again, evil king, does bad things. And he's the king that we talked about this past Sunday about when the scroll of Jeremiah is brought before the king. He is the one who cuts up the pieces and throws it into the fire every time something he doesn't like is read, which is the entire scroll of Jeremiah. And so it's one of those, luckily Jeremiah probably wasn't there because in Jeremiah, there's a story of he's told to go talk to the king's courts. And this isn't Jehoiachin, it's to Jehoiakim. So this is before Egypt has kind of forced them out. And there's a story of God that says, go prophesy this message that Judah will be enslaved like an ox is enslaved. And it's kind of similar to how, like in the United States, we'll have like G20 summits or like really big international conferences. Well, that's kind of what was happening in Judah, in Jerusalem. Jehoiakim had brought together the kings of Moab and Edom and Ammon, and there was representatives from Egypt and Assyria, or the remnant of Assyria. There's remnants of representatives of Babylon, and they had brought them together and having a feast. They're kind of enjoying each other's company because it's early on. They hadn't started arguing about whatever, and it's very similar to one of those international conferences. But Jeremiah gets up and he's wearing a yoke for an ox and just starts preaching wearing a yoke of an ox. And the guards and everyone's like, dude, just take off the yoke. He's like, no. He refuses, and he keeps preaching about how look around King Jehoiakim. The people who surround you at this table will be the people who put you in bondage and will bondage your people and take you away and treat your people and the people of God like farm animals. They'll be treated like they'll be enslaved again. They'll be treated worse than a farm animal would. And the king keeps yelling at him, take off the yoke, because that's what he's getting away from this, Jeremiah needs to stop wearing this yoke around. And then finally the king takes it off his neck, and so Jeremiah smashes it against the column. And it's a very dramatic scene. But it's one of those moments where looking at this, Jeremiah would have lost his temper if he smashed a yoke and broke it against a column for someone losing their temper, that he was using a yoke as a servant illustration.
Those weren't flimsy things either.
No, it wasn't. It's one of those where you're like, man, Jeremiah was yoked in two ways, if you would. And so it's one of those where it's probably good it was Baruch who's there, but it still has to be that like moment where Baruch is standing there is like, how long did I spend writing for you to just tear this up and throw it into the fire? Now I'll share the story. Might as well. So in one of my classes at LSU, I will keep the professor nameless and I'll keep the student nameless. It was like right before COVID, but the professor was trying to like make a point about, I think, late work or something. Mm-hmm. And the student did not turn this essay in late whatsoever. It was just what was in his hand. And that student had made some comment that, I don't know, it was a weird day. But because it was like the final paper. Final papers in the Bible department require way too many sources and way too much writing and way too much reading. And so like, it's not way too much. It's probably a good amount of reading. and it's probably what you should be reading. But it's one of those while you're writing it, you're sitting there thinking, please, could I get a 5-page paper, not a 20-page paper or something? And the professor just sits there and rips it in half in front of the class. And it wasn't because it was a bad paper. It wasn't because the paper was turned in late. It was just what was in his hand, and he was trying to make a point. And so I think Baruch would have kind of related, or that student Etta in that moment would have related to Baruch, because he sat there. This is a 20-page paper. It took him at least a month and a half of lead up to writing and turning in this paper, and that's with typing it. And so it's one of those. Baruch has been working at this for months, years, however long, and he's had to listen to Jeremiah, which I'm sure at times was probably pretty dry. It's like, Jeremiah, I've already written down the sermon. And Jeremiah's like, no, write it again. I told it 3 times, and so you need to put it in 3 times. And so Baruch is sitting there, and to watch the king just sit there and cut pieces off and throw it away, like it has to be like defeating, demoralizing. But Jehoiachin not king very long. Turns out when you're installed by a foreign power, people don't like that. And so what happens is Jehoiakim comes back in power for a very brief time, just for Jeconiah, Jehoiakim's son, to become king, right as Babylon is at the gate. Like there is nothing left to Judah but Jerusalem. Like Egypt is not even a threat anymore. They are just now subjects of Babylon. Like, well, I guess they're not fully subjects of Babylon. They're just enough. They're back to that weird. Yeah, we'll be second fiddle to Babylon because it's better than being destroyed like all the other countries who oppose Babylon. And so Egypt's kind of independent, kind of doing its own thing, but it's not wanting to get destroyed. So they're on the side of Babylon. And so the pharaohs have pulled back. Necho has died by this point because Pharaoh Necho, of course, he's doing what all the other kings do, except the ones who are actually realize, hey, it's probably not wise for me to be on the front lines every battle, especially because if I have the fastest horse and the best chariot, it's going to be easy to notice which one's my chariot. Yeah. And so that's going to be where they focus. Anyway, Jehoiakim, or not Jehoiakim, Jeconiah, whatever. He becomes king and looking ahead in Jeremiah. We haven't gotten to this part on Sunday morning. I don't know which week it is, so I'm sure I'll spoil it. The Bible's been a book for how many years? It's not a spoil, like this is centuries ago. We're not spoiling anything. And so there's a threat that, of course, the kings don't like Jeremiah. People don't like Jeremiah. It's, again, a point that's repeated every week. Jeremiah's unpopular. He keeps preaching. He keeps doing it. And so this is after they've thrown him in the well and pulled him out, put him in the cistern and pulled him out and imprisoned him and realized, yeah, that's just making it worse. And so they decide, you know what we're going to do is we're going to kidnap Jeremiah and take him with this last fleeing party to Egypt. And God says, if any of the people go to Egypt, they'll be destroyed. If they have faith and remain in the land of Judah, they won't be destroyed. Because at this point, back up a little, Babylon's not exactly at the gate. There's still some pockets. Bethlehem hasn't been conquered. There's pockets of where Judah can still have its autonomy. And Babylon's not fighting like the Philistines had or the Assyrians had, where they want to destroy these cities. They're okay with you there. It's just they don't want you remaining as an army. They don't want you unified. They don't want to. So, it's just Farmer Ted and his family. Yeah, they can stay in the field. They don't care. Whereas the Assyrians and Philistines, they were burning everything that they came across. us. They were just like, no, you are enslaved because we came across your house. But that's not how the Babylonians are seeing Judah. They're just seeing it as, well, we have to make our point, and these kings have big mouths, and they don't understand. You can't have a big mouth when you're the smallest guy in the room. And so that doesn't go well. And so they're seeing it as, well, we got to put them in this. Anyway, so God's saying, Jeremiah, the people should not flee to Egypt, because if they flee to Egypt, Babylon will come and they will destroy Egypt. Not destroy, they'll destroy the dynasty of Egypt. And so yet another ruling class comes to power in Egypt. But what we see is they kidnap Jeremiah, thinking that's what they need to do, because that works so well every time they've done anything else towards Jeremiah. Every time I think people are stupid nowadays, they were also stupid then. So I think it's just people are stupid. And so it's one of those, they take Jeremiah to Egypt, and very shortly after, well, we'll go back to the map. Let's go back to the map, shall we? Egypt has expanded into this region. And so taking him to Egypt meant they're probably taking him to Gaza or somewhere in the Sinai Peninsula or Migdal. So it's not like they're taking him into the heartland of Egypt where the Exodus happened from, because the people of the Exodus happened probably either in Memphis or Thebes. That was where they were, and so because, well, to get out of there, you have to cross the Red Sea, and so it's one of those. That's kind of why they think it's that. That's not really important now. The idea is he's not super far away from being back in Judah, because they take him away, they capture him. Babylon attacks, pushes Egypt back. Egypt, of course, is scattered, and conveniently, everyone who had fled to Egypt, thinking that's going to be how they escape torment, they decide, yeah, let's go back to Jerusalem. And Jeremiah is kidnapped back away from Egypt, back into Jerusalem. And so it's a weird, like, I'm sure it's one of those where Jeremiah can only hold his tongue for so long, because we were wasting how much time? I could have told you this was going to happen. We could have just stayed in Jerusalem. But Jeremiah gets free just in time to see the destruction of Jerusalem. It's not a pretty sight. Like, it's one of those where Babylon has to. They're putting Judah in its place. It's reminding me of you on a political level. You are not big enough to call the shots. You are not big enough to think you're all that. You are weak. You are little. You're whatever. From the perspective of God, it's putting them in their place of, you turned away from God. The power that could have saved you, you rejected entirely. Like, I gave you a prophet, and you did not listen. I gave you multiple prophets during this time. You did not listen. You didn't understand the simple messages I was teaching. I have given you. Originally, this is where we're going to stop. So some of this is going to sound like conclusion material. Going back all the way into the time of Saul, we had prophets kind of telling kings, don't mess up. You have been called to be king. And to be king, you have to act different. You can't do whatever you want like the other kings can. The prophets are there to correct you and lead you back towards God. Saul loses favor with God because Saul thought he knew best. He thought he could do the things of the priest and do the things of the law by being king, which again is kind of hairy because David did it, but then looking even further down the line, Uzziah tries to do it, and he's a descendant of David, and Uzziah got punished, and Saul got punished, but David didn't. And so we can think about all those things, but even looking at David has his moments of really strong faith and really doing what God wants. And God says, go and fight the giants, and David said, all right, how many? And David is a teenager, and he's being thrust into like military leadership. He's a young man. He's on the run from the king, and it's one of those, like, David's doing a lot good, but then he also commits murder, conspiracy to murder. He is an adulterer. Some may even argue he raped and like pillaged, and like he's no better. And yet, um, it's there's a prophet who comes and corrects David. He calls David out on what he does. And David, unlike descendants, have a full turn. Like he turns back. Every time he's willing to recognize, oh wait, maybe I shouldn't be leading the kingdom by this example. Because David, I think, is one of the few that actually got the idea through their heads of, oh, I'm king, which means I'm the example of everyone else. If I'm doing these terrible things, they're going to say, well, the king does it. And if he's the example of the fall of what the law looks like, I can do whatever. Like we even see it today. The president does it, that means everyone thinks, well, if the president can do it, I can do it. Well, no, that's not how the law works. And no matter how fast the president gets to go down the road with the motorcade, that doesn't mean you get to drive anywhere near that fast. And so it's one of those moments of there's been time and time again, and finally God has to bring them back into order. It's going to seem harsh, and it doesn't seem harsh. It is somewhat harsh to think there's a destruction of people, kind of. There's a destruction of a nation. There's a destruction of an identity, but it had become a bad identity. It had become something that the people shouldn't want to be considered only by the walls and the buildings and the structures and the flags they fly. The people should be wanting to be identified by their God. And that's kind of the lesson. You don't put your faith in the walls. Don't put your faith in the kings and the armies. Put your faith in God. So, Jerusalem, and Judah. Jerusalem and Judah are destroyed. They're wiped out. This is one of the more famous paintings of the destruction of Jerusalem because it's also like it's a moment in which you see everyone is being driven from the city of Jerusalem. This is unique because yes, the Assyrians and Philistines and the Egyptians, they all took slaves to the land they conquered, but it's not in this fold. They're not taking an entire city and sparing their lives. That's what's significant. Is they're sparing. They're not going through door by door, killing some and keeping others, and they're taking everyone out of their home and taking them back to Babylon. And at this point, Jeremiah is no longer just preaching; he's lamenting. The Book of Lamentations is kind of that snapshot moment of he's making his first gut reaction to seeing the walls and the city of Jerusalem on fire, the people being led away. He's seeing the chaos, the destruction of what people had built their hopes in. The temple has been vacated. The temple is on fire even. So he writes Lamentations, or Baruch writes it down for him. Whichever you want to say happens. And so it's one of those moments of he is lamenting. And I think one thing I think we forget is just like the laments of David, there's that first gut moment is just like, this is awful, this is terrible, I want to die. It's one of those, this is the worst thing ever. But in Lamentations, Jeremiah comes to the realization, similar to what David does in all of his laments, of this is about God. The song we sing, "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases," that's a quote from Lamentations. His mercies are new every day. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my strength and my shield. Those are from laments. He lays me down by clean waters. Again, a lament. David is lamenting, and yet he recognizes the Lord is my shepherd. It's likewise Jeremiah is having that moment of, this is the worst moment of my life. um, I think back a couple weeks ago. I say this, and part of it's true, and some of it's an over-exaggeration. When the Texas Rangers won the World Series, it was the greatest moment of my life. Is how I kept saying it, and there was part of me that could not believe that the Texas Rangers won the World Series, and so like that whole weekend, I just kept repeating it to myself over and over and over again because it had been so good. But I think back to 2011 when 10-year-old Bergan suffered and the Texas Rangers had lost the World Series after being so close to winning it. And it was one of those moments of, this is awful. I hate everything. And this is the worst moment of my life. Was it really? Kind of. Did it make it hard to be a Rangers fan? Especially because shortly after that, the Astros got in the division and they started winning. Yes. Did it sting when the Astros won 2 World Series before the Rangers got back to being good and watchable? Yes. But it's one of those moments of, is the destruction of a city the worst thing ever? Not really, right? It's kind of that moment of Jeremiah in that first moment. Yeah, he's looking around and like, this is awful. This is the worst thing ever. In the long scheme of things, Jerusalem is just a city. The temple is just a place. Like it has no bearing on God. It has no effect on what happened. And that's what we see in Lamentation. It's Jeremiah coming to that point of, yeah, this was awful. But really, that doesn't have anything to do with it. Yeah, it was awful that the Rangers lost Game 6 of the 2001 World Series. And I cried when I was 10. And it stung for those years. Was it the end of the world? No. Were good things still to come? Yes. Because we won the World Series this year. But it's one of those moments of Jeremiah he comes to this maturing point of realizing, unlike me, who was 10 when the bad thing happened, still fighting them when the good thing happened. Jeremiah has that moment of wisdom of, yeah, this is awful. This is the worst thing right now. But there's something good coming up. And we can argue, I guess we don't have to argue. We know what it is. And it's one of those things that drove me crazy about some of my classes at LCU and now at Harding, because Old Testament scholars, they like to keep it only in the Old Testament. There's very few that like making the jump to the New Testament or from the New Testament into the Old Testament. That's not how it's supposed to be read. Sure, the New Testament authors clearly didn't read the Old Testament as they quote it all the time. Anyway, so it's one of those moments of, well, we could say the good thing to come is the return from the exile. Yes, that's a good thing. But there's something even greater coming. And I think Jeremiah is kind of starting to point to that as well. As there's going to be a return, because all the major prophets kind of make this turn. Isaiah kind of did it, but his time is, I guess the book of Isaiah covers both the going into exile or the lead up to the going into exile with Hezekiah. But then there's a portion of Isaiah that could not humanly be written by Isaiah because it happens like 200 years after. Not saying it was all written in different parts, but it's one of those, there's a snapshot from 200 years later that even at this point, kings aren't living that long. Maybe in Genesis, it would be something if someone saw something happen after 200 years. This is not that point anymore. And so, anyway, but Isaiah will point to, yeah, there's a return, but there's still something greater to come, even as he's looking at the return. Jeremiah, he doesn't necessarily write about the return, but or from the point of, he's not writing when they return, like Isaiah does, or as the book of Isaiah was written. And so it's one of those, Jeremiah is looking out and he's realizing there is something good to do. There is something even greater to come. Because the major prophets, yes, they're major because they just wrote more, but they're also major because they had a point that, and it's all looking towards Christ or the Messiah. Because again, Old Testament scholars often are mostly Jews because that's what they hold as their holy books. And so it's one of those, yeah, you get a bunch of Jews. And so, of course, the consensus is going to be, no, it wasn't pointing to Jesus because they don't think Jesus was the Messiah. But you have to sit there as a Christian and think, yes, he was. Yes, this is referencing Christ. And it's another aside. I'm full of asides. And so it's one of those, there was an argument in one of my classes about whether the suffering servant was talking about Christ or just Israel in general. I don't think it really changes the interpretation of whether Israel is the suffering servant or it's Christ, because it could be both. It's describing this gruesome pain. Except there's some of those lines that you're like, wait a minute, that's directly a link to Christ. Like that is something Christ does. Like that is something that the gospel writers made sure to include because that's important. And so it's one of those moments of Christ is coming. Christ, there is a look forward, but also there's a hope of this destruction, this captivity won't last forever. And so where we leave off is the Neo-Babylonian Empire, also considered the Chaldean Empire, because they fight over names, because it's one of those ancient kingdoms like fighting over names. That's why there's an Assyria and there's Syria. Like they're all trying to claim the same name or the same roots, so because all their languages have mixed together. Hebrew hadn't really mixed with anything, just because going into our world history. So this is the Tigris and Euphrates River, and right here is the Mesopotamian river civilizations. It's the breadbasket of Mesopotamia. No one's really living down here except nomads who, they've figured out ways to trade Persia through the Gulf, but they're nomads and they're not really organized. Anyway, but this area specifically is the main trade routes. They have the river, they have everything around there. It's the breadbasket of civilization. And really with Jerusalem, the only interaction they get is with people from Egypt trying to trade with people up here in Mesopotamia. And so, but also by nature, we see it when we come into the land. The Jews are intending to be different. The language is different, their customs are different. And so, of course, it's going to be one of those things where, the Egyptians aren't trading with the Syrians or the Syrian, or they are trading with those guys. They're not necessarily concerned with the Jews. And so, this side is going in a weird direction. And so, really, it's just what we need to know is Babylon is considered the Babylonian Empire because of it's the capital of Babylon. We see this with the Byzantines. The Byzantines is called the Byzantines because the capital used to be called Byzantium. Has nothing to really do with the nation. The nations, if you really want to get into it, it's the Greek Roman Empire, more than just the Byzantines. The Byzantines is just keeping the namesake because that's what the capital used to be called. And the Chaldeans used to be what the people were called, but when Babylon became the power, it became the Babylonians. And so, because they were recognized by the capital. Anyway, that's it. But it's the Neo-Babylonian because it's like the second time they become an empire. Because Assyria was the power. They kind of subjugated Babylon, so that they weren't calling themselves an empire when you're serving someone else. That's kind of foolish. Very few empires do that, except I think the Holy Roman Empire may count just because, yeah, they were under the Spanish Empire, but they were also their own empire because the Habsburgs were everywhere. Anyway, and so when they come back to power under Nebuchadnezzar, there's the new Babylonian Empire of Chaldea. And then one last thing we have to mention is Obadiah. We don't know when it's written. We can kind of assume Obadiah is writing or prophesying or preaching or whatever we want to consider it during this time of Judah's being destroyed. Jerusalem's going, it's being burned. The people are being led away to Babylon. Because the message is to Edom, which is, let's back to this map. It's right where this guy is. These sticky notes are covering up where Edom is. And so they're looking across the Dead Sea and they're saying, well, there's all that land there. There's all those empty fields where we could grow our crops and have our sheep and tended to it there. And we have all this land, and this could be the moment in which we can succeed. And we don't have to worry about Judah, and because Edom is going back to Esau, and Israel goes back to Jacob. And so it's, even though Esau was big brother, they've been treated like a little brother for quite a while now. And so we don't have to be the little brother in the neighborhood anymore. We can be the big dog. And Obadiah's message is, you don't want that. You don't want to take advantage of this, because if you take advantage of your neighbors' disadvantages and their faults, you will be destroyed just like they were, because you'll fall into the same traps. You don't want to have the wealth of Judah, because one, that then attracts Egypt and Babylon to make an example of you, like they made an example of Judah. But also, we'll see when the Jews return, they kind of have to go back through a conquest period, not in the extent Joshua did, because some of the land is granted to them by the Persians. But it's still one of those moments of they are fighting wars to keep this land. They will not hesitate to fight a war with you either. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so next week, this wasn't planned in the at the beginning of this quarter, but I thought it would be good for us to spend some time talking about Judah in exile. And so we'll have that not next Wednesday, because next Wednesday we have a Devo. I'm sure many of you are more focused on family or wherever you're going to be for Thanksgiving. So I'm not going to be here. You guys can meet up here and talk about it. But we'll really be meeting, what is that, the 29th? 29th, we'll be talking about this. And in December, I'll have a brief mini series that we'll be doing for the month of December. So thank you guys for being here. And I guess they enjoyed it too. So thank you guys for being here. Well, you guys have any questions? I should ask.
I have a few.
Okay.
So I know there are many minor prophets, but so we're saying that there are about 3 minor prophets that would happen in this, like under the, you have like Jeremiah, and you have like 3 minor prophets, which was Zephaniah, Obadiah, and Habakkuk. Okay.
Yes. Okay. And well, even like last week we had Isaiah, but then we had Micah and Nahum.
Okay.
And then even going further back, yeah, Elijah and Elisha were the main ones, but you also had Jonah and Amos and you had Hosea. And so they're all, that was something that I struggled with too. I thought, oh, it's the 4 major ones, and then right after them it's 9.
Yeah, that's how I.
And they all, it's the order that they're in, it's the order that they happened. Nope, not even close.
Okay.
And so it's just, I think, no, I'm not going to go out on that one. I was going to say, I think they may have just organized them by length. I don't think that's right. But it would kind of make sense because you have the longer ones and you have the shorter ones.
Yeah.
So, because they definitely did not put it in chronological order. But they also didn't put Kings and Chronicles in chronological order. Well, independently they are. But there are some small jumps where Kings will make a jump in time, and Chronicles does not make that jump in time. So it's just one of those. It's weird. They're not concerned with chronological ordering of the books because that's not well, they are, but on a large scale. Here's the writings of, well, from end of Deuteronomy. It's Joshua, Judges, King, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. So it's the time of Israel as a nation. And everything before that is Israel as a people group. They haven't really become a nation. They're not fighting. They're being formed from a family into a nation, or into a large people group. And then you have the time of kings and them being a nation. And you have the time of prophets, which that's mixed in, as we've seen through this class. But it's ordered as, here's the prophets. Here's all of the prophecy, the books of prophecy. And then you go, well, you have all your Psalms are put together, all your Proverbs are put together, all your, I guess they're not Ecclesiastes because that's the book, name of the book, not the name of their writing. Ecclesiastes and all those messages of Solomon are put together. And then you would get like Esther and Job, which are happening back here, but they're not kept with them. And actually, we don't even know when Job happened, or if Job is a parable or whatever. And because listen to that, some of these, you have scholars who argue that these are parables. Some argue Job's a parable just because they can't put it on time. They don't, like, none of the references to times and places make sense to any of them because they're like, we have no idea what historical record this is. And so there's some of that. And then there's some who say Jonah, for it being so abrupt of an ending, like, that doesn't seem like it's like the book of Jonah ends and Jonah's just sitting there. So it's like, well, it's not Jonah writing this. It's not someone who observed Jonah. So, or maybe not directly observed Jonah. And so what happens? And so they're like, well, it sounds like someone was telling a story and then it stopped. Yeah. And so they're thinking, well, it's like a parable. But of those who argue, well, parables didn't exist before Jesus. No, that's not how styles of stories happen. Parables happen because that's
most of the rabbis do a lot of the teaching through parables.
Exactly. Like,
they existed before Jesus.
Yeah, it's foolish to say parables were invented by Jesus. I mean, in a way, they were. Yeah. Because Christ was the Word, and the Word was in the beginning, and nothing came but through the Word. But parables were not invented by the incarnate Christ. It was invented by people and we're telling stories. Anyway, that's another weird aside. I forget why I was going on that.
Minor prophets.
Oh, yeah. And so, like, you see some of these books of the Old Testament, you're like, I don't know why it's kept that way, but that's how it's been kept for centuries. Yeah. There must be something to it. Okay. That I'm just missing. And it's really easy for us to play the ignorance card because it's been centuries when we weren't in the room when it was decided. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. There are mysteries of God that shall remain mysteries until the end. So it's kind of like the New Testament. Like the epistles of Paul, not in order. Yeah, they're not even close. And then you get to the argument of, well, where was Paul when he wrote this? Well, they could have been between this time when he was in Corinth, that time when he was in Corinth, or that time, because there's certain places where when it says the last time I visited you, which time was that? You visited him, like he hits some of the same places over and over and over again. And like Acts doesn't help clear any of that up. And so what we have is there for a reason. And it's good. Yeah. Yeah. If anyone else.
I was just thinking with Job and Jonah, that's a name.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why would you put a name in there if it wasn't supposed to be affiliated with the person?
Yeah, that is because Jesus' parables don't really have names. There are a few that have names, but it's more of like naming a character.
Yeah.
Like the rich man and Lazarus. Oh, somehow we're supposed to know who Lazarus is. There's a good case it's not the Lazarus we know who was raised from the dead. So who is this Lazarus, and who are we supposed to know?
Maybe Lazarus was just like our Bob, the placeholder.
Yeah, and so it's one of those like
Just a common.
Joe Schmo.
Jonah. And so it's one of those like, yeah, there's that argument, but there's also the like, it could be just a name for it because I don't know. Sometimes I'm sitting there like, yeah, it makes sense it's a parable. And sometimes I'm sitting there like, but it makes sense that this is actually what happened. Yeah. So.
Well, that takes away the position of God in that position too. I mean, when you're thinking of what Job went through and his friends. And,
yeah, like it has to be like a very detailed parable.
Yeah.
Like, because even
over and over and over.
Because even with the dead man and Lazarus, God's not the one who gets the majority of the speaking role. It's Lazarus who tells them, if they didn't believe in God, you are around. What's going to make them believe in a dead person? Like, that's Lazarus. That's not God. And so it's one of those moments of, I don't know. But I am late for a meeting, so I'm going to have to let you guys go. Thank you guys for being here.